Peace on earth. Is that just a cliche? Or is it just a far-off idea? Is it impossible? The history of man has been the history of war. Today, the major powers hold each other at nuclear gunpoint. Sadly, this is what suffices for peace in our world today. And while some nations consider themselves to be at peace, for now, they are full of violence within themselves. This is not what the Creator wanted for His creation. God is allowing us to do this to ourselves as a form of aversion therapy, so we can see what going our own way apart from God produces. But God does have a plan for all of humanity. It is a plan that will finally bring the peace that nations have so long desired, and He has given us a preview of what it is He is going to do.
The Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the program. In March of 1979, 40 years ago this month, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty in Washington, D.C. with U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Many people are aware of this incredible history and the key statesmen who helped bring it about. But few people, however, know about the role played by an unofficial ambassador for world peace, a man named Herbert W. Armstrong. Today we're going to be offering some new booklets, or at least booklets that we haven't offered before on this program. This one here, An Ambassador for World Peace. That's what Mr. Armstrong was known as in the world of diplomacy. He traveled the world, meeting with many of these great statesmen of his day, and he sat down with them in their offices in some cases and talked to them about the way to peace. Mr. Armstrong was friends with Menachem Begin and definitely with Anwar Sadat. We're going to talk also about some material in this booklet, The Way of Peace, Restored Momentarily. We probably don't give this booklet enough attention, but this is a wonderful little booklet. We produced it back in 2012, so it's a few years old. But The Way of Peace, Restored Momentarily, what can this be about? Well, it's about this incredible history that we're going to talk about on today's program. This incredible peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, historic enemies, a treaty that ended 30 years of warfare between those two nations. And we'll look at Herbert Armstrong's role in bringing these two enemies together. Herbert Armstrong was a man who knew a lot about the way to peace. He spoke several times, as I say, with these leaders and talked to them about what God says about peace. We're going to begin our study today in the book of Isaiah, a book that we go to a lot, and it has a lot to say about peace and how it will come to this whole earth. Isaiah 59, just the one verse here, verse 8, it says, "The way of peace they know not, and there is no judgment in their goings. They have made them crooked paths. Whosoever goes therein shall not know peace." And so Isaiah 59 in verse 8 is talking about the time in which we live right now. There's other passages in this same book that describe a time of great peace and unity and prosperity to spread over all the earth. Of course, that's coming at the return of Jesus Christ. That happens when the kingdom of God is established on this earth. But here in Isaiah 59 and verse 8, it describes the world today, and it says about mankind, it says, "The way of peace, they don't know the way." Now, what's important there is that there is a way to peace. What the prophet stresses is that man doesn't know it. The prophet Jeremiah talked about the ambassadors of peace weeping, and he talked about others saying, "Peace, peace," when there really is no peace. So today you certainly have a lot of talk about peace, but there's really very little in the way of actual peace. Now, in the case of this incredible history, going back to 1979, what happened 40 years ago, this peace treaty signed on March 26th, 1979. In the lead up to it, what you had, particularly with Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, you had a change of heart or a change in attitude. He had typically led the way in fighting against Israel, but in the mid to late 1970s, he changed his thinking, and that's what led to this historic peace treaty signed in Washington in 1979.
This is certainly one of the happiest moments in my life. It is a historic turning point of great significance for all peace-loving nations, those among us who are endowed with vision cannot fail to comprehend the dimensions of our sacred mission. The Egyptian people, with their heritage and unique awareness of history, have realized from the very beginning the meaning and value of this endeavor. In all the steps I took, I was not performing a personal mission. I was merely expressing the will of a nation. I'm proud of my people and of belonging to them.
It was a historic turning point, and all you need to know to realize just how historic it was just some of the history in the years leading up to the signing of that treaty. Martin Gilbert, in his book Israel, A History, notice what he had to say. No war in the past had ever been launched against Israel without Egypt being the leader, and then the other Arab states following. No war against Israel had ever ended without Egypt being the first to pull out, and then the others following. So for 30 years, Egypt led the way in attacking Israel. Egypt led the other Arab states against Israel. That had been the history for more than a generation. And Martin Gilbert writes about that in his book. In fact, even in that very decade, the 1970s, you had the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And then Egypt, as I say, led the way in fighting against Israel. And then how does Anwar Sadat end up in Washington with the Israeli Prime Minister and the U.S. President signing this peace treaty and saying those words that I just played for you? He said this is a historic day, a real turning point in Egyptian-Israeli relations. And he hoped that it would be a turning point in the relationship Israel had with its other neighbors. That didn't very well happen, but it certainly did with Egypt. What a turnaround. They've pretty much had peace ever since, Egypt and Israel. There's some minor skirmishes here and there, and certainly there's a strong Muslim Brotherhood influence in Egypt that would probably fight against Israel if they had the power. But here was an example of an individual who sought after peace, and he really took action. In fact, he risked his life. If you go back and look at some of those last few years of the 1970s, the U.S. president, to his credit, Jimmy Carter, he really wanted to try to bring both sides together, and they were having difficulty in doing that. And it was Anwar Sadat, really, who decided himself, I've got to take the lead. Let me take you back to Martin Gilbert's book. He says, Sadat extricated himself from the possibility of American and Soviet pressure by taking the bull by the horns, as one Israeli diplomat expressed it, and deciding to take a direct and separate initiative on his own, or of his own, a visit to Jerusalem. He decided himself, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to go forward alone if I have to. And that took some courage. This was a difficult time in Israeli-Arab relationships. Very difficult. The PLO in Lebanon, they were firing missiles into Israel. You had the Entebbe hostage crisis in 1976. I mentioned the Yom Kippur War in 73. And yet, in 1977, Anwar Sadat decides, I'm going to go to Israel. If they'll have me, I'm going to go and speak directly to the Israeli people. This is what it says in Martin Gilbert's book. This was after a PLO attack in northern Israel. It says later that day, the same day of this attack by the Palestinians, President Sadat, in a speech at the opening of the Egyptian parliament, said that he wanted to address members of the Knesset in Jerusalem. I'm willing to go to the ends of the earth for peace, he said. Israel will be astonished to hear me say now before you that I am prepared to go to their own house, to the Knesset itself, to talk to them. Israeli officials couldn't believe it. They thought, well, surely this can't happen. He can't be serious. But he said that right in front of Egyptian parliament. And you know what? He followed through. He followed through on that statement. And the BBC reporting on that said that, again, people in Israel had a hard time believing it, and that if he did that, it would break with the long-standing Arab policy of not dealing publicly with the Jewish state. That was just something that couldn't be done. If you're going to talk with the Israeli state, you have to do it through back-channel negotiations, but you don't talk with them publicly. So here is Anwar Sadat breaking with that long-standing Arab tradition. And he followed through, as I say, and it led to his visit to Israel. And of course, all the press, they were on hand. They had a hard time believing it as well. He visited Israel, the Knesset, in 1977, and on the anniversary of that visit, here's what the Times, this is just from a few years ago, 2017, the Times of Israel was writing about this visit here, Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. And they said Sadat became the first and so far only Arab leader to visit Israel and address the Knesset with a call for peace. The first and only Arab leader to go direct to Israel and say, look, I want to make peace. Yitzhak Rabin, who had been prime minister for Israel just a few years earlier, he couldn't believe it, but he said that when he met Sadat personally for the first time, he found him to be very impressive. He said he was enormously impressed with this man who used to be Israel's arch enemy. And now what a change. What a remarkable change. Well, that visit in 1977, it culminated in what happened in 1979, March of 1979. In between, they had the Camp David Accords, and so there were these discussions, these negotiations, and then finally they were able to make peace. I want to take you back to the Martin Gilbert book. He said this, President Sadat was there, speaking of the Camp David Accords. The leaders of other Arab countries, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, as well as the Palestinians, refused to join him, however. But Sadat persevered. Whatever agreement he could reach, he would present as one that had been reached on behalf of the absentees as well. How about that? He just took the lead. Well, I don't care if the others don't show up. I want to reach a peace agreement with Israel, and I hope that it stands with their neighbors as well. That's some kind of courageous leadership, I'd say. We're getting a little bit of a glimpse here into how nations are going to make peace in the wonderful world of tomorrow. There's going to have to be a change in nature. There's going to have to be a change in attitude. And both sides are going to have to be willing to reach out and to actually back up diplomacy with action on the ground, with peacemaking action. Now, Herbert Armstrong, I mentioned him at the top, he was tremendously impressed with Sadat's courage, and he said in a program, this goes back to 1977, here's what Mr. Armstrong said about these peace negotiations that resulted in that 1979 agreement.
It happened on November 20th, 1977. President Sadat declared not war, he declared peace on Israel. He braved a personal visit to Jerusalem to speak before the Knesset in Jerusalem. Now I want you to consider his position. Egypt was then the leader in the Arab world, and Sadat was the leader in Egypt. The Arab Union had its headquarters in Cairo. He was the leader of the whole Arab world. He risked all of that and the irate hostility of the whole Arab world in going on a mission to peace to speak to the Knesset in Jerusalem of the nation of Israel. It took vision, it took courage, it took, let me say it, guts. It really did. And it took great risk to his own person and risk to his political position.
It took courage, as Mr. Armstrong said there. It was a gutsy move. He risked his life, and if you know a little bit about the history that followed, he later sacrificed his life. He made himself a target to his enemies by reaching out to make peace with Israel. Now, my father gave a program a few years ago where he talked about this booklet, The Way of Peace, restored momentarily, and he's describing in this next video clip, he too is describing this tremendous outreach by Sadat back in the late 1970s.
Mr. Armstrong called it the most incredible peace overture of modern times. And frankly, the only one, he also said. After 4 bitter wars against Israel in 30 years, President Anwar el-Sadat did an unheard of thing. On November 20, 1977, he declared peace, not war. At extreme personal danger and unprecedented political risk, the Egyptian president braved a personal visit to Jerusalem to speak in peace to the Israeli Knesset. It was the most sensational overture toward international peace made by any head of state in our time.
Now he's talking there about some of the material, some of the content in this booklet that we're offering for the first time here on television in the UK. Make sure, if you haven't contacted us before, take the time to do that today so that you can be brought right up to speed with this history, this remarkable history, this incredible peace agreement, because it does give us some insight into how peace will spread over the earth in the wonderful world of tomorrow. Jot down the information on your screen. Call our operators today and request both of these free booklets. We'll be right back.
The Trumpet Daily.
We talked about some of the history, the geopolitical actions that were going on in the 1970s. Let's turn now to this unofficial ambassador for world peace, Herbert W. Armstrong. He first met Anwar Sadat in 1974. He had been meeting world leaders for several years, but even still, he was taken aback by the fact that when he arrived in Cairo, they rolled out the red carpet for him, and Mr. Armstrong was able to meet with the president of Egypt and with his wife. This was in 1974, just a year after the Yom Kippur War, years before this peace agreement would happen. Then later in the decade, just after the peace agreement, Mr. Armstrong wrote about another meeting that he had with Anwar Sadat. This is from 1980. Notice what he said in a coworker letter. He said, "At the palace, the president entered first, and we were met at the entrance portico by the First Lady, who took my arm and walked in with me. Inside, awaiting a brief meeting with Mr. Sadat, was a group of U.S. congressmen. I was told that they stared in amazed disapproval, wondering, who are those non-official Americans and what are they doing here?" See, these U.S. officials, these congressmen, these leaders, they thought, well, we're the diplomats. Who is this religious man? Who is this non-official American? And why is he here? Why is he arm in arm with the Sadats? And why are the Sadats interested in bringing him into these discussions? Well, when you look at what Isaiah prophesied, we read it in the first segment, man doesn't know, even the most gifted diplomat, he doesn't know how to make peace. Look at the 6,000 years of human history. Look at the wars, the endless, ceaseless wars. Look at the wars going on around the world even today. Going back to Herbert Armstrong and what he said to Sadat, following that peace agreement, Sadat wanted to build this World Peace Center in the Sinai, very close to Mount Sinai. And here's Mr. Armstrong describing some of those details.
I recently returned from another Middle Eastern visit. I had personal conferences with Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel in Jerusalem and with President Anwar Sadat of Egypt in Cairo on this visit. In Cairo, President Sadat showed me the architect's renderings of a proposed $70 million peace center that he's proposing now to build at the foot of Mount Sinai. Could it be possible, I ask you this question, could it be possible that events of the 80s at Mount Sinai, in Cairo, in Jerusalem, and at Camp David are actually a prelude to world peace at last after all these thousands of years of war and of troubles and of evils on this earth?
That's Herbert Armstrong talking about these events as being a prelude to the peace that would soon spread over the earth. He went on to say, Mr. Armstrong did,
now the Sadat Peace Center has a significance that it could have at no other place on the earth, right at the base of Mount Sinai. A peace center like that, showing cooperation instead of competition, peace instead of war, could not have such a significance any place except where God delivered to the prophet of all three religions, Moses, the Ten Commandments.
That's Herbert Armstrong again, talking about this peace center. He wanted to be a part of it. He wanted to contribute to it. He felt like here's the Islamic religion, here's the Jewish religion, and an American religious unofficial ambassador for world peace. He said this promoted cooperation instead of competition. It promoted peace instead of war. We need more of that in this world today. My father, this is in the Way of Peace booklet, he said obviously Mr. Armstrong knew they weren't going to solve the problems and have peace in the world. He knew the prophecies that this world will end violently and true peace can only be achieved once the Prince of Peace returns. Still, he did all he could to represent peace and to promote peace in this world, and he demonstrated his strong desire that all men work toward that end today. He really worked toward peace, Mr. Armstrong did. And you can say the same about Anwar Sadat. Now again, you know the history, many of you, following that peace agreement and then the push to try to build this World Peace Center. In 1981, the Muslim Brotherhood gunned Sadat down. They assassinated him. Like I said earlier, he made himself a target. He risked his life. It just shows the evil, the forces of evil in this world. They're all around us. And it really and truly is going to take the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ, ruling this earth as King of Kings and Lord of Lords to bring peace to all of the earth, not just one little tiny piece on this earth, piece of real estate, but to all of the earth. To read more about this prelude to peace, make sure that you contact our operators and request the Way of Peace, restored momentarily. And then to learn more about Mr. Armstrong himself, the unofficial ambassador for world peace, ask our operators for this free booklet as well. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.